Is this a systematic breakdown of our entire financial system that we're seeing at this point?
I believe what we are witnessing is to put an umbrella over it all. I think what we're witnessing is the death of fiat money.
As we move forward throughout this year in 2016, how do you think this is going to play out with this death of fiat money?
Well, I think we've got a pretty good hint or a good sniff at what is actually going on right now, because we've got a number of countries around the world that are currently hyperinflating because their currencies are racing for I'm going to say for the goal line, and the goal line for all fiat currencies is that they all ultimately reach their true intrinsic value, which is zero.
Mm.
And we've seen this in South America, in countries like Venezuela, where they have runaway and rampant inflation. We've seen this in, I believe it's Brazil, where they're experiencing much the same problem. We're seeing this in numerous countries in Africa, where the countries that are perceived to be petrocurrency countries, as in countries where the sustenance of their governments and their government spending plans and their currencies are all sort of propped up by crude oil. And with crude oil plunging, of course, these currencies that are perceived to be petrocurrency countries, their currencies are under severe pressure. And I know that firsthand, being here in Canada, because we've seen the Canadian dollar go from in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen the Canadian dollar go from a premium of a $1 Canadian being worth as much as at one point $1.10 American, to today, $1 Canadian will buy you 71 cents American.
Wow.
And what that's meant for the average layperson here in Canada is that the cost of a salad and the cost of buying fresh fruit at the grocery store has in a lot of cases like more than doubled. So everybody's grocery bill, for any kind of an imported grocery staple, has just gone up dramatically. So other countries are feeling this. I know that countries around the world that are petrocurrencies, they're all feeling the same. I know that Nigeria is having this problem. All the small countries, that are whose fortunes are tied to the extraction and production of crude oil, who are not pegged to the dollar with hard pegs, are experiencing this kind of difficulty. So anyway, my guess is, Dave, this is going to continue, and other currencies around the world that are dependent on natural resource extraction will find themselves in much the same boat as time goes along. So the list of countries where hyperinflation is already happening is a growing list, and that list, in my belief, will continue to get bigger. And the last place it will be felt, realistically, is in America itself. And uh, anyway, that's where I think we're headed.
No, I agree with you, and I've said this before in my reports, is that it seems like everything around the U.S. is hurting right now, and it's coming inward into the United States because we see Europe, like you mentioned, Canada, where you are, Australia. Someone emailed me that the housing bubble is popping in Australia, and we're starting to see all these nations really start to break down. We see inflation, we see things getting worse, bubbles are popping, and it seems like everything's being sucked right back to the source, which is the United States. And
And I'm going to interject here,
sure,
Dave. But that's only partially true,
okay,
because what we have seen empirically, by the U.S. Treasury's own data that they produce, global reserves held by foreign central banks, global reserves of U.S. dollars have been dropping. And what that means is foreign central banks are actually shedding U.S. Treasuries, and to a very substantial factor of like close to $1 trillion in the last sort of year to 12 months, and that also conflicts with the whole narrative of a strong dollar, and it begs the question: who's doing the buying of the treasuries that foreign central banks are selling, and who is also doing the buying at the ongoing auctions? Because I mean, the United States is still running tremendous, fiscal deficits where they need to, where they need to sell, your amount of treasuries, new treasuries, on top of the maturing ones. It begs the question: who's buying them? And with foreigners selling, why is it rates are rallying? Like, why is the 10-year bond, since the Fed announced its tightening, which I believe is a complete and utter ruse anyway, but when the Fed announced their tightening campaign back in December, we had the 10-year bond at 230, and I think today it's at $1.95 or $1.94, and that's, I mean, all I'm saying is, what we're seeing empirically, the narrative that we're being fed through the mainstream press is not accountable to or consistent with empirical realities. If the Fed's tightening and if foreign central banks are dumping U.S. government bonds, why are yields rallying, and why is the dollar strong? So, and the answer to that, of course, at least in my books, is that it's the U.S. Treasury itself, namely a specific entity within the U.S. Treasury called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, that has resources that are beyond most people's belief or comprehension, in my opinion. I believe they're directly monetizing or buying the bonds. So, it's whoever or whatever is buying the debt that's being pitched by foreigners has extremely deep coffers, and seems to be immune to just about anything.
What is the Exchange Stabilization Fund? Is this within the U.S. Treasury?
Yeah, it's the Exchange Stabilization Fund was created in 1934. And it was created with the proceeds of the confiscation of gold from American citizens. When the gold was confiscated from the American citizens, and when they were given fiat money in return in exchange for their gold, the U.S. Treasury revalued that gold upward in 6 months after they had done the confiscation. And this created a $3 billion windfall profit in the revaluation of the gold upward. That $3 billion was used as the seed money for the newly created Exchange Stabilization Fund, or ESF. And the ESF was given a mission statement of it will defend the integrity of the dollar as the currency in international trade. And in doing so, they put the ESF above any oversight whatsoever, so it doesn't answer to Congress, and they gave the ESF the ability to, in the name of national security, to operate above all laws, foreign and domestic, and they have the ability to operate in literally any market or anything that they deem that they, when I say they, the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, has the ability to operate in any market or in any fashion he sees fit, as long as it's in the name of national security. And over the years, what this means is the ESF has been involved in everything from regime change, narcotics trafficking, murder for hire, arms running, and anything else. Let your imagination run wild. And these guys are capable of and do operate in all these realms with impunity, and they answer to nobody, and they cannot be held by under U.S. law, they can't be held responsible for their actions. And if it sounds like, there's a little tinge of totalitarianism or something that sort of might smell a little bit like Germany in the 1930s to this. You might want to just even consider that one of the framers of and proponents for creating the ESF was, I believe his name was Harry Dexter White, and he was an avowed communist who was very influential in the creation of this institution. And further to all this, I would highly recommend, if anybody's intrigued at all by this exchange stabilization fund and the topic, is you take a visit to marketskeptics.com, the website, and that's a website that was created by a chap by the name of Eric D. Carbonell. And Eric de Carbonell created a 4 or 5 part YouTube expose on the ESF. And Eric de Carbonell is a very smart fellow who created this expose on the Exchange Stabilization Fund back about 4 or 5 years ago, and then a couple months after he created this expose, he literally disappeared off the face of the earth, and nobody knows where he is. And but his site remains up and operating. And if you go to the right-hand margin on his homepage, marketskeptics.com, you will note an entry where it says something I've been afraid to blog about the ESF. And if you click on that, it'll take you to the YouTube series that details and chronicles the formulation or foundation of the Exchange Stabilization Fund and exactly what they get up to, and their interaction between the ESF and their prime broker, who they use to execute all their orders when they're in the capital markets. They exclusively use the trading desk of the New York Federal Reserve to execute their orders in the market. And the New York Federal Reserve disseminates the ESF's orders into the marketplace. So anyway, I'd recommend that to absolutely anybody who is twigged at all with the Exchange Stabilization Fund and this secret stealth entity that's within the U.S. Treasury.
It seems like there's a power structure inside our power structure. It's like a shadow government.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. That's the big enchilada. That's what's really been captured with the takeover of America. And it's this entity that gives the globalists, at least in my view, it's this entity that gives the globalists, their punching power ultimately. And it's also why the presidency is such a big prize. It's not just because the president can invoke or executive orders and be seen to be acting as a dictating by fiat decree. Mm-hmm. It's the capture of this dark entity and being able to shape and aim the I call it the forces of globalism. And it's really represents the capture of the United States, the capture of the government, and the capture of the bureaucracy, and really the capture of because this is the hand that feeds the military-industrial complex. This is where, like, when the Pentagon has $8 trillion in spending they can't account for, these monies have flown through this dark entity in the U.S. Treasury.
So, do we know the players, the ones who operate the ESF?
The operator of the ESF is the Secretary of the Treasury. That's who the figurehead is. That's who is, whether there's a secretive group of bureaucrats who just get recycled from one administration to the next or not. I don't know. But ostensibly, it's the Secretary of the Treasury that has the hand on the control of the ESF, because it is operated. It says in its mission statement that it's operated at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury. And in so many cases, so many people like to point, for all of our economic and monetary malaise, so many people like to point the finger at the Federal Reserve. And all I can tell you is, if you watch the expose that I referenced by Eric de Carbonell, you'll see how Mr. de Carbonell characterizes the U.S. Treasury as being very, very happy that the Fed takes all the flack publicly, because operating behind the scenes, it's not the Fed at all. It's really the Exchange Stabilization Fund that pulls all the big levers and has their hand on the pulse of power. So, with that being said, I would suggest to you it is the Secretary of the Treasury, and I think that's why being the Treasury Secretary is a very, very, very straining and demanding job. And if you think back over the years and you look at the people that have occupied that office, from the likes of, we've had Robert Rubin, John Snow, this chap who's currently there who's another ex-City banker, Jack Lew. I don't know so much about him, and he's managed to have probably one of the lowest profiles as U.S. Treasury Secretary that I can ever remember, because he seems to be Mr. Invisible. You never see his name in the media, and I would suggest to you that's exactly the way the folks at the Treasury are very, very pleased that it is that way. But anyway, the ESF does exist, and the reason we know so little about it is because they don't publish financials. And you see, everything that the ESF is engaged in is all in the name of national security, and talking about it in the media makes one about as popular as Edward Snowden. And this is why there's so very little reporting or very little questioning as to what exactly these chaps are engaged in.
It just seems like there's so many layers. I mean, you have the central bankers, you have the politicians, you have the ESF, and it just seems like there's just so many layers. And as we find out more and more as time goes on, we're starting to realize that we have power structure inside power structure, basically controlling everything.
Yes.
And we really have no say in any of this. It's whatever they want, and that's what they're going to do. I mean, how does this fit in with China, the yuan, what's going on? Are they threatened by what is happening right now with the amount of debt, with the dollar dying? Is this making them nervous?
Well, my take on this is that if China was supportive of what this shadow government or shadow institution inside the U.S. government, if they were supportive of what they were doing, I doubt highly that China would be erecting parallel infrastructure to the World Bank, to the IMF. Because the World Bank and the IMF were institutions that were created at the conclusion of the Bretton Woods agreements at the conclusion of the Second World War, and don't mistake yourself at all for a minute. The World Bank and the IMF were created to perpetuate the dollar as the world's trade settlement currency. And the fact that China is erecting parallel structures to the IMF and the World Bank tells me and screams to me that China's preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the chief unit of exchange in settlement of world accounts. So, they certainly don't seem to want to work within the current system from the standpoint of they're building parallel structures which will support their own currency, which in my mind, very likely in the very near future will, what we're going to find out publicly, that the Chinese are backing their currency with tangibles, and probably at the head of the list of tangibles will very likely be precious metal. And there could be an agro comment, uh, component of this as well.
We continually hear from the talking heads, and uh, Bloomberg had an op-ed about a cashless society, and we're hearing a lot about, okay, we need to get rid of cash, and we're seeing countries now, saying, okay, like Norway, we're going to get rid of cash right now, and we're going to have a cashless society. Why is there such a push right now to get rid of cash?
Well, it's I would say it's there's a number of reasons to it, but first and foremost, I believe it's a Keynesian's wet dream that we would have a cashless society, because after all, it's Keynesians who are destroying the value of money as what we know it, and to get rid of cash, or to outlaw the use of cash, is sort of like uh, you know it's the pinnacle of Keynesian debauchery, where you destroy the value of money, and then you just basically through criminal, sociopathic, psychopathic management of the system, and then you sweep the whole stinking mess under the rug by outlawing cash, and maybe for good measure starting a nice big war to cover your tracks, and this way you can blame it on, you can make statements like, who could have ever seen this coming? Nobody could have ever imagined such a thing could happen.
Right.
Are these not words? Are these not words that we've heard out of the former chairman of the Federal Reserve in the last 15 or 20 years?
Yep.
I mean, wasn't it Greenspan who said, how could you ever spot a bubble until it broke?
Right.
And Bernanke with his comments of everything's contained, and then you catch him in a moment of candor, like in the last number of months when he's been interviewed, and he shows a bit of candor these days when they ask him to reflect back on his comments, and he said, well, I didn't want to be seen as I couldn't tell people to head for the hills. I mean, this is the way the man absolves himself from blatantly lying and misrepresenting the state of affairs to the public. He absolves himself by, well, I couldn't really tell people to run for the hills. Well, gee, thanks.
Yeah, I don't think they're ever going to tell us the truth about what's really going on. I mean, if we go back to 2008, I mean, they told us that, they weren't forecasting any type of recession. During the year, we had the entire system start to fall apart and collapse. And we're starting to hear the same things again, but, the junk bonds, they're contained. They're telling us that everything is fine. And it just seems like they keep the illusion alive until the very end. And they don't want to take the blame. They want to blame other people and or countries or groups. They never take responsibility for what happened.
No, but you know what, Dave? I agree with everything you just said. But you know what? It actually, some of this gives me some hope, because the extent to which people in positions of power and leadership, the extent to which they have lied to us, people are now beginning to wake up to it. There is an awakening happening. People are beginning to understand the extent to which they've been lied to by leadership, the extent to which they've been robbed and stolen from by leadership, and people are beginning to understand that it's all happened by design, not by mistake. And people are learning that they have been fleeced, and they really are the sheeple. And when sheeple awaken and realize that they have been sheeple, People can even jellyfish can grow a bit of backbone. And the notion that we're witnessing this happen, I think, is evidenced by the rise in populism, which is underscored and underlined by the rise in popularity of the likes of Donald Trump, who is somebody who is not from the old boys club, somebody who's a political outsider, and somebody who talks common sense, and somebody who seems, at least on the surface, whether you like him or don't like him, he seems, at least on the surface, that he's not afraid to turn over a few rocks and ask some pretty hard questions. And that in itself, in my books, is probably sending, uh, 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 absolute lightning bolts of fear through the hearts and minds of the current establishment that's been running America for the last 3-4 uh, presidential administrations. So this is a big thing, and this to me is all part and parcel to the awakening that is occurring. And I believe this awakening is going to continue, and I think it's going to, and its progression, I think, is going to accelerate. And it's got to be striking fear into the likes of many, many of the current elites who have commandeered not only your country, but others in the Western world as well.
How close are we right now to a complete collapse of the financial system?
I think we're palpably close. I think we are literally creeping along the precipice of a sheer drop into an abyss of some sort. And I do believe that once it gets underway in earnest, there will be no stopping it, and it will have to play itself out. And I think it's going to get very, very, very nasty at some point in a very short period of time.
Do you think the power structure, the ESF, the central banks are just going to just let the system fall apart?
No, they haven't been letting it fall apart all along. They've been doing everything in their power. Like even as governments are dumping U.S. government treasuries, they're buying them up, trying to create the narrative that the dollar's strong and trying to keep people believing it. And this will last so long until somebody, and it might be someone like a little dog who pulls the curtain back, and instead of this great strong dollar, they're just going to see a very tired old frumpish Treasury Secretary behind the curtain pulling levers and blowing smoke out his ears.
I mean,
And it could be metaphorically that kind of an event, you see, because the exchange stabilization fund's wealth is all off book, and these are dollars that aren't acknowledged to exist, and the amount of these dollars is mind bending. And if the world ever wakes up to the notion that the world's monetary stock, instead of it being X, they find out it's really 5X or 10X, the value of the currency unit could fall off a cliff overnight. And it won't shock me if this ultimately is the way this plays out, because you see, at some point, it's going to come home to roost that creating you see, and this is what underlies everything that I'm talking about. At some point, when you're creating money in infinite amounts, it really does go to its true intrinsic value, which is zero, because you can't print money out of thin air indefinitely and fool Mother Nature. And this is seemingly what the U.S. Treasury has been able to do by keeping so many of these dollars off book and out of people's hearts and minds, and out of the realization of the bigger world, that that this much wealth or this much money in dollar form has been aggregated and concentrated in such a small place, and the extent to which it's been done. So, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the biggest secret that the U.S. government has in the whole world, is the true extent of the off-book wealth that's contained within this dark entity at the U.S. Treasury, the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Because to my reckoning, they probably have tens of trillions of dollars worth of off-book money that they can mobilize to try to, stick as many fingers as need be into dikes that are cracking. Fiat dikes are breaking everywhere in the world. Fiat currencies are breaking down everywhere in the world. That's an empirical truth. That is not a conspiracy theory. That's a truth. And fiat currencies are breaking down, and this is why the dollar has to be made look impenetrable and the steady as she goes currency, the gleaming light on the hill. And the reality is it just isn't. And the reality is it's all being done through theatrical stagecraft. And the reality is it's all being done through fraud, corruption, and lies.
Rob Kirby, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. How can people see your work?
You can catch me at kirbyanalytics.com. And I don't do so much writing publicly anymore. Dave, the writing that I do, I just communicate directly via email with my subscribers.
Rob, thank you once again for being on the Spotlight.
My pleasure being with you, Dave.
Thank you.